Hey guys, I'm Ethan, co-host of the Shieldwall Podcast. First off, thank you guys so much for listening. I wanted to ask all of you who enjoy our content to subscribe and comment wherever you listen. Follow us on social media. We're on all major platforms. If you have any episode suggestions or questions, definitely shoot us an email at shieldwallministries@gmail.com.
Welcome to the Shieldwall Podcast, where tempered men are formed.
Yeah, so like I said from last week or 2 weeks ago, whenever we met, that figured we could start diving into some what are called traditionally defeaters. And the reason they're called defeaters is they, are supposed problems that are presented to the Christian theist, and are meant to represent reasons why Christianity isn't true, or it's quote unquote defeated. So figured we could start out with the big one, the one that we will inevitably come into contact with, as this is probably the preeminent reason people give for why A, they don't believe in God, or B, they're struggling with belief in God, or even for believers, right? When something happens, the problem of evil, the fact that evil exists, the fact that we suffer, can cause us all at some point in time to kind of question things. And so I figured, we need to spend some good time here and just kind of work through the different levels of this problem, as there are different facets to it. So just some opening thoughts. The existence of evil in the world is a problem for people in relation to belief in the existence of God. Okay? So basically, the fact that evil exists and the fact that God is supposed to exist, are those two things incompatible, right? Do they pose a problem? All right, my power. Okay. The presence of evil and suffering in the world influences beliefs one has about God. And this is not a new problem, right? So I have a quote here in the next slide that I want to look at, and it's from a guy named Epicurus, who lived in, the Grecian Peninsula in 300 BC. He wrestled with this very idea. And so I want to show you this quote because it's a pretty infamous quote by him. And it goes like this. Is God willing to prevent evil, but not able? So the assumption would have been, okay, he's willing, but he's not able, then he must not be omnipotent, right? He must not be all powerful. Is he able, but he's not willing? Then he is malevolent or evil, right? So the assumption there being, he has the power to do it, but for some reason he doesn't, and he's evil because of it. Is he both able and willing? The question is then, whence cometh evil, or where is evil? What is its source? If God's both willing and able to do away with it, why does it still exist? Is he neither able nor willing, then why do we even call him God? Right? If he doesn't have the capacity, then we should probably worship something else. So this is a very old problem. It's been around for a very long time. I have a more modified one here from a Scottish skeptic named David Hume. You guys may have heard that name. He says it just a little bit differently. Is he willing to prevent evil but not able? then he is impotent. Is he able but not willing, then he is malevolent. If he is both able and willing, whence then is evil? Why does evil exist? So the problem of evil can be broken up into two main groups. One is the intellectual problem of evil, and the other is the emotional problem. So talk about the emotional first. Think of it this way, is when you are usually in the midst of experiencing some sort of suffering or pain in the world, we can have that kind of emotional crisis, right? Where we just feel this immense pain and struggle, and we really begin to question, why this is happening to me. The reason I put non-intellectual here, this is not to say that someone who's experiencing this type of experience is kind of irrational. That's not the thing. It's just, it's not traditionally thought of as kind of reasoning through the problem, because in that given moment, in that state where you're experiencing that emotional experience, it's just more about that than it is kind of thinking about it when everything's good and there's, peace in your life. And so that's one side. The other side is the intellectual problem, and that's the one where, philosophers and theologians and Bible scholars, all those people have written about it, think about it, discuss about it, create certain arguments to either support or reject the view. And so that can be broken down into two further categories: the logical and the evidential problem of evil. I want to talk about those two first, and then we can kind of move on from there. So the intellectual side, the first part of the argument is the logical problem of evil. And so why this is important is because I think it's good for us to understand, what's being claimed here. When someone says that the existence of God and the existence of evil is a logical problem, that's making a pretty big claim, okay? Because what they're saying in essence is that it's actually illogical to believe that God exists, that he's good, and that evil exists at the same time, right? And so philosophically speaking, this is a very strict position to take. There's a large burden of proof on the atheist to make this claim, because it's like saying, if you're thinking of terms of what's logical and illogical, something illogical would be like, 2 + 2 = 5, right? Or a married bachelor, or a round square, like those things are illogical. They don't exist, right? So it's a very big burden of proof to be able to show definitively that those statements are in fact illogical. What do I mean by those statements? I realize it'd be better if I give you an example here. So basically these two premises here, right? If you affirm that an omnipotent, so an all-powerful, an omnibenevolent, so all-loving God exists, if you believe that, and you also believe that evil exists, which we are very want to do because it's very real, we don't deny that that's the case, those two statements are essentially illogical. That's the view. That's the argument, that you can't hold both at the same time. They can't both be true and you remain logical, because that's the argument. So it's important to note, and I want to unpack this a little further, because those two statements, to say that someone is illogical for believing those, requires two further kind of implicit assumptions that someone's making when they make this claim, okay? And the reason we're going to point these out is because they help us to start to understand this argument and unpack it a little more and ultimately offer a response. So for someone who's making this claim, they are also assuming, 3, if God is omnipotent, then he can create any world he desires. And then 4, if God is all loving or omnibenevolent, then he prefers a world without evil over a world with evil. Okay? Now, the key to kind of unlocking or debunking, if you will, the logical problem is that if you can show that something's even possibly the case, you don't even have to prove that it's true. All you have to show is that it's possibly true that this is the case. Then you can make the claim that it's not illogical to believe God's all powerful and all loving and evil exists at the same time. One of the most famous Christian philosophers in our time, his name is Alvin Plantinga, and he wrote a book called God, Freedom, and Evil. And he really took on this challenge. He took on the logical problem of evil. And basically his argument was this: if it is even possible that creatures have libertarian freedom, that they have some sort of responsibility, that they have some sort of freedom to choose and to act. Not necessarily true that an omnipotent God can create just an impossible world that he desires. Okay? So I want to pause there for a second, because this is where it can become challenging to think about. Because when we've been taught, that God is omnipotent, we've been taught that means he can do anything, right? But if we really start to think through all the possibilities, there are some things that God can't do. And I say that slowly and hesitantly because I know that can sound contradictory, but if you think about it, God can't do the illogical. He can't make 2 + 2 = 5. Why? Because that's not logical. It's just not real. God can't act outside of his character. Right? His character is good, and he acts according to his character, right? He can't lie, or he can't not love. He just does, right? When God chooses to create, and he decides to create for a certain purpose, it could be the case that God couldn't create any world he wanted and still achieve that purpose. And let's call that purpose creating a world in which free creatures choose to love him. Right? So even if it's possible that world exists, and we believe it does, where there's a world of free creatures, then that shows that this problem is not illogical, right? That you can be logical and believe that God is all powerful, all loving, and that evil exists at the same time. So the good news is that this kind of position was held kind of early on in the 1900s and into the 50s and 60s. But Plantinga, through his book, almost single-handedly dismembered the very strong position that it's illogical to believe God exists based upon the existence of evil in the world. But I start there because atheists and skeptics and those that are secular have shifted the position, and they say, okay, fine, it may not be illogical, okay, which is a very strong thing to have to prove, but let's look at the amount of evil and suffering that's in the world, right? This is known as the evidential problem of evil, and says, given the amount of pain and suffering that we see in the world, it's unlikely that a good God exists. Now, notice they didn't take the strict, like, it's illogical, which is very hard to prove. All they've said is, okay, it's more likely than not, right? If we look at all the natural disasters that happen, if we look at the millions of years, supposed millions of years of death, dying, and decay that we've seen from the evolutionary process, if we see the coronavirus, right, that's affecting hundreds of thousands of people, it's wrecking economies. If we take all these things, cancer and disease and, children who get these, all that, everything you can think of, all the injustices in the world, and you weigh that up and you stack it up, their argument goes, well, it seems more likely, more probable that God doesn't exist. And you can kind of feel the force of that argument, right? If you really just start to think about all the evil that there is in the world and all the suffering that takes place and the stories that we hear about, and the pain that we've experienced personally and all around us, it can, wow, you could see where someone could reasonably question whether or not God exists, and if he does, is he good, right? Is he worthy, of worship? So I think this evidential problem made in this way does pose some challenges for the believer. I think there's some very good ways to respond, but before we go into that, just as I've presented that, the evidential problem, the probabilistic problem of evil, what would your kind of initial thought be? And this is where you can unmute yourselves, but what are some initial thoughts? How would you initially respond to someone who's making that case? And before you give an answer, let's also keep in mind what we talked about previously with the inside out and how we can apply that method, when we engage somebody. Let's see if we can put that into practice a little bit. But just thinking out loud, if someone were to present that to you, what are some thoughts? What do you think?
The first thing that if someone posed this question to me, the first thing that I would recognize would be that you are right. The universe being evil is a problem, and it's an issue, and it's terrible. That's the first thing I'd recognize. Like we can all agree on that. But this problem and the one you just talked about has a really big presupposition behind it, and it's there. If evil exists, God must do something about it. Like that's for him to be good, he must do something about it. And the underlying assumption here is that he didn't do anything about it. When we know that Jesus came to die for sins and save people. So their whole fundamental understanding is that God has not done anything to prevent evil, and that's fundamentally not true. Instead of wiping out the world like he did under the covenant of Noah, the covenant was after, but instead of wiping out humanity, which he had every right to do, he sent his son to pay for sin and enable man to have righteousness imputed on him. So that's one way I would respond, is to identify that the issue of an evil universe is terrible and it's an issue, but also just to bring home that God did do something about it.
What are let me further ask this. So Ethan pointed out one assumption that's being made by the person making the claim is that God doesn't exist, or at least God hasn't done anything about the evil and suffering in the world. So that's one assumption. Can we maybe identify any other assumptions that are being made either rightly or wrongly by this person? But yeah, what are some assumptions that we could identify in their argument? Again, given the amount of evil in the world, that God doesn't exist.
I think one of the assumptions they might be making is that the prevention of evil, is God's ultimate responsibility, and kind of in making that his responsibility, or maybe overlooking the idea that like freedom of choice, for humans, if that exists, right, then perhaps he has a value system that differs from ours, and perhaps allowing a freedom of choice is a higher value than ridding the world of evil for God.
Yeah. So the assumption would be yes, that, or the kind of the response would be that freedom, right? The freedom in and of itself is a greater good, and human beings possessing that outweighs the evil. If we were to put it on a scale, right, it outweighs the evil that we see in the world, because God's intention was for us to be free creatures that would, freely love Him. Yeah, definitely. That's one way that people have responded to that assumption.
Yeah, I guess another thing in line with that would be the assumption of like, would you as a human being want to be controlled? Like, in a sense of, right, if you want God to eradicate evil, then there would be a level of control he would assert that we would lose, right? And we're talking about freedom and all that stuff, and I doubt every human, especially those who don't believe in God, are gonna just give up their freedom. I don't know if that makes any sense, but you're kind of like, people who deny God, they want a level of control, like get rid of evil, but that means that he would need to control every single human being, and it's not God,
Yeah.
But that sure makes sense. But
yeah, and I think freedom is a big underlying factor in this, definitely. And I think that kind of, if we could take one step back, right, we could say that one of the assumptions that the person's making more broadly is that there are no overriding reasons that could outweigh evil in the world. That's an assumption that's being made by this person.
One thing that I wanted to mention, Kevin, is too, in that, can you hear me?
Yep.
One of the things too is that there's an assumption being made that God does not have an overriding higher purpose to allowing evil for a certain time, which we know he does. We know that God intentions evil deeds for good, and that was talked about between Joseph and his brothers, right? Mm-hmm. God used the evil that was done there for a good purpose, and it was to, save the Egyptians from famine, and bring favor to the Israelites through Joseph and his patriarch status in their nationality. So God allows evil for a good purpose, both for justice, in that he allows evil to happen so that his justice can build up. We know that from Scripture, and we know that he allows evil so that he gives opportunity for people to come to him and be reconciled to him. So yeah, that's one of the things I wanted to add, is that God does have a higher purpose for allowing evil for a time. Yeah,
that's good. Let me add a couple things here to the good points that we've already been sharing about, what are some assumptions being made. So here's one thing to think about. Relative to the full scope of the evidence, God's existence is probable, right? The point is that probabilities are relative to the background information one considers. So when we're considering whether or not God exists, right, and responding to someone who doesn't think God does, we don't just look at the problem of evil. Although we want to be able to respond, we don't want to dodge, but our belief in God is not based upon solely how we can respond to this. And so there's a slew of, other reasons why we believe, other arguments about God's existence that we can rely on. Another thing, basically, is just, and this is not to say to be skeptical on the matter, this next point, is just to say, look, we're not in a good position to assess with confidence the probability that God has no morally sufficient reasons for permitting that evil occurs. Yeah, it's a pretty tall order for someone to be, to say, look, I can look out among all of the things that go on in the world and assess, that for all the evil I see, God doesn't have a good reason to allow it to happen. I mean, that just we don't have that capability as human beings. It's beyond our ability to know. I mean, it's not to diminish the fact that evil does exist and it's real, but it's just to point out that I don't think we're in the position. We don't have the epistemic access to be able to make that broad of an assessment.
I mean, I think I would agree with that, but I think that would be kind of a rough thing to say to somebody in this type of discussion, because to that statement, I immediately am like, so you're saying that you don't have the capacity to say that, murdering a child is wrong, or that that's just evil and that there is no good coming from it. There's no good reason for it. You know what I mean? That I think that would kind of get you into hot water in my thought. I don't know.
Yeah,
it seems kind of like a
brutal.
I agree.
Yeah, like a brutal point to try.
It's just a hard pill to swallow. It's not to say that God can't use it. For sure, people coming out of that, either they have the choice to
right, exactly.
To,
but maybe it would be
grow from it or not. But
it would be more beneficial for someone,
right?
Like you were saying, in the intellectual discussion versus the emotional discussion. Obviously, someone who's going through the emotional discussion or the emotional experience, we couldn't say that to them. It would just be helpful versus the intellectual side of things. I think in everyone's head, sure, do we have the capacity to say what is good overall and what is evil over, always? I can follow that, but it's just tricky.
And I think that's a good point. And one of the reasons why I wanted to separate the two levels of conversation, and that's where we're going to have discernment to see, get to know this person a little more. They may just be coming off of a death in the family, right? Or, have really some emotional issues connected to these thoughts. And so it can be tempting to kind of jump into, let's have a debate about it when there's emotional factors at play. And so, I think that can be a good point. But at the same time, it is a reminder that we are kind of limited as human beings. And while there may not seem to be, any good that's overriding a certain example, you could just say, look, it's hard to know that there's not, given, the situation.
Sure. No, I mean, I hear what you're saying. I'm just...
But it's a good point.
I think that could easily shut someone down very quickly to be like, okay.
It reminds me of the book. I had a mentor once that recommended. Have you guys ever heard of Shattered Dreams? It basically talks about how God shatters your dreams on purpose. I mean, that's legitimately the point of the book, and just to make you a better, stronger person. And that just to me is this. God uses it, but that's just one thing. It's one thing to say God does this on purpose to make you stronger versus God can use this to make you, this experience was not intentional for you. You shouldn't have gone through what you did or whatever. You know what I mean? wording is so important when it comes to this.
I mean, you can continue. I know, like, I think we
No,
all know
this
what
is
you were
good.
saying, but I just think, like, you would have to get to a certain point in the relationship to be able to have that type of, to have that piece of the discussion.
Yeah. I think that's a really hard thing to swallow, like, especially like if you know someone or have gone through something like very difficult, like that's a very, like, I understand it now, like that God uses things in our lives, bad, good, to help us grow, to help us learn, to help us, help other people, you know what I mean? Like, but when you're going through really difficult things, it's like, it's almost nearly impossible to hear that said.
Maybe I could add one more line of explanation to the relevancy of that point, is that part of the argument is that there are evils that we see in the world that are gratuitous. And what that means is that they're ultimately meaningless.
Yeah.
Right? That there's evil we experience, that there could possibly be no good that could result from that, is an assumption that's often made with this probabilistic argument. And often they'll point to maybe certain natural evils or, like the very extreme cases. And so I agree. I think this point could be delivered delicately, but it's kind of a balance and a reminder that there definitely could be.
No, definitely. I don't disagree whatsoever.
Yeah. But yeah, obviously delivered with delicacy for sure. So, yeah. We don't have to go for too much longer. We can just maybe, a point where we could maybe come to an end, or just pause for next week as well. But I think we can add to the conversation that Christian theism entails doctrines that increase the probability of the coexistence of God and evil. So this would be presenting, positive reasons. They're, within the Christian framework and mentality, but these are possible reasons why God would allow, evil and suffering to exist, and we can still call him good. The chief purpose of life is not happiness, but the knowledge of God. Now, let me unpack that just for a second, because you may say, well, hold on a second. It's not what Piper said, right? What's his, we enjoy God most when, I forget how it goes. Ethan probably remembers that, but.
We enjoy life most when we enjoy God, or something along those lines.
Yeah. So what I mean by this is that I think the world, and this is, again, not to desensitize evil, but this is just to offer perspective, right? It's not to deny that it's real. We say, look, within the Christian framework, the chief end of man is not the pursuit of happiness, right? The chief end is to pursue God, to know God, which, as Jesus tells us, right, I've come that you might have life and have it more abundantly. Happiness is the result of knowing God. It is a byproduct of living like we should. And so it is, kind of the prevailing idea is that we have to pursue happiness at all costs. And Christians say, no, you pursue God at all costs, and then happiness will follow. Knowledge of God helps to shape and frame our perspectives on the world, even our perspectives on, pain and suffering. Two, and I think, Ethan, you kind of alluded to this, is that, mankind is in a state of rebellion against God. And so there are some evils that we could point to and say, look, those are caused by man, and God had a purpose of creating man with freedom, and with that comes the option to reject God, and from that follows further rejection, further moving away, acting evil. And so that is a Christian nuance, that man is fundamentally flawed to some degree and rebels against God and does evil things. Now, admittingly, this doesn't cover the whole span of evils that we see in the world. We can't attribute every single evil that happens to humanity, and so, but it at least offers us another kind of perspective to conversation. Here's a big one I think that we can sometimes lose focus of, is that God's purpose is not restricted to this life, but spills over beyond the grave into the life to come. It might be the case that God's purposes for allowing a certain evil to occur isn't realized until the life to come, but that once we are there and once we can look back and see the result, we can realize that, a much greater good did come out of that evil that at the time seemed like there was no good to come out of it. And so eternity is a huge, I think, factor in this conversation, is that, well, this life is not all that there is, and God's purposes are not confined just to this life. So another kind of Christian doctrine that helps us understand the existence. And we can point to the knowledge of God itself as a incommensurable good.
One thing I wanted to add to your third point, God's purpose is not restricted to this life, but spills over. One thing that occurred to me when you were saying that was the ultimate good is coming out of the ultimate evil. And what that means is that the ultimate evil that ever happened, probably even worse than the initial fall itself, was the murdering of Jesus Christ. That, in my mind, is the ultimate evil. But out of that ultimate evil comes the ultimate good, which is the Savior rising again, being enthroned in heaven, and then bringing many sons of glory through him. So that's one thing I wanted to add, is like that would be a really good thing that we can immediately point to and say, this ultimate evil occurred and it spilled over into eternity, and it has incredible implications.
Yeah, that's right. I think, and this is something I want to bring up next week as we continue the conversation, but I can briefly mention it now. There's more to this, right? There's more kind of responses we could give to the assumptions that are being made. More reasons why God might allow suffering and evil to occur. And we can kind of formalize those more next week. But one to think about is, it has a Latin phrase, right? It's called O Felix Culpa. And it basically stands for, oh, blessed fall, or oh, like beautiful or happy fall. And it basically suggests that the fall was part of God's plan all along, in that Eden was never where, man was intended to stay, in that the goodness that comes out of Christ on the cross, God displaying his love for man in such a way, is such a great good that the fall itself just basically doesn't hold a candle to. The evil doesn't hold a candle to the goodness of Christ on the cross, right? That, and the interesting point too is that we would have not known about that otherwise. Imagine if Adam and Eve never eat from the tree, and we live in the garden. The argument is the world is more beautiful having seen God's love on full display on the cross in Christ than had it never happened. I feel like Janie's about to chime in. I see.
No, it's about, it's the idea that, you know, you look at the Christian who grew up in the church their whole life, and they love God, they know God, they understand and see his goodness, and in a lot of ways take him and everything that he's done for them for granted, if they've never experienced the same kind of rock bottom experience that, you know, other person who may or may not have grown up in the church but understands God's grace for the first time and sees and feels and knows what God did for him or her. You don't have the same appreciation.
Yeah.
God.
Yeah, it's almost like we can't even comprehend the lengths that God went to becoming human and dying on the cross for us. But just the fact that the parts that we can comprehend are of such a great good that the existence of evil in the world is outbalanced by and outweighed by that good. It could be a very challenging concept to accept.
Fine line.
Say what?
It's a very fine line.
Yeah, I mean it's an interesting thought, and I kind of wanted to leave it at that thought just because it gives us something to mull over. But yeah, I think one of the things we have to keep in mind, and this will carry over into next week, is that, you know, what did God intend in creating us, right? What were the purposes of God when the Trinity, you know, decided to create? And I think we have to keep in mind that the reason freedom is involved. My point is, like, you know, freedom and love, you know, God wanted us to come to him in freedom. You know, love exists only where there's true freedom. And so those are some things that I wanted to leave us with. We can definitely keep kind of talking more about this, but I feel that was a good kind of transition point to move on to next week. But let me just kind of leave it at this. I want to leave some open-ended questions for us to think about. So, you know, the mother and going through the pain of childbirth, you know, there's this outweighing good, that there's this connection and bond. But I think we could also say that there are other instances of evil in the world where we couldn't point to, oh, you know, this happens as a result, right? And so let's think about, like, this week, like, what other kinds of evil are there, you know, are experiences that you know, the reward seemingly doesn't outweigh the pain, you know. What about natural evil in the world, right? What about tsunamis and, you know, the tornado that ripped through Nashville, and the coronavirus, you know, all those things. There seems to be certain kinds of evil in the world that kind of strain our ability to find, you know, good reasons to account for it. So while I definitely agree that we can point to some evils and say, oh, there's a clear representation of good that comes out of it, it's worth it. You know, you can think about the athlete training and the pain that the athlete goes through to achieve this, you know, championship, right? And things like that. But are there instances, or what are some instances of pain and suffering where, man, I might have a harder time accounting for that, right? If someone asked me like about the deer that's in the woods that gets caught or all the kangaroos that, that got stuck in Australia, right? These natural evils, what good comes out of that? Why does God allow that? Why does God allow evils that, perhaps may not seem necessary, right? If someone's murdered or rape or, all those sorts of things, abuse. So not to end on too much of a down note, but we're kind of at a point where we are recognizing where there are some evils that we could point to a corresponding good, but then there's some examples that might be more difficult, right? And so let's think about those this week. Try to come back with an example of something where, man, I really don't know how to account for this, and then let's see if we can work towards some responses. There's more that we can add. There's more we will add next week to kind of reasons that have been given as to why God allows, certain things to happen. But yeah, I think that'd be good for us to think about. Maybe it's something that someone's shared with you before, or you've heard that argument before. But yeah, let's see if we can come back with some that can really try to flesh out.
Thank you for listening to the Shieldwall Podcast. Our goal is to glorify Christ and strengthen the hearts of men. We've got more episodes on the way, so if you liked what you heard, subscribe and share. For more info and articles, visit our website, shieldwalldiscipleship.org. You can also find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Just search for Shieldwall Discipleship. Thanks again, and until next time, hold the line.